The scream of wind through the cemetery gates carried more than storm. It carried the ghost of another child's cry, one that had haunted Kwana Whitehorse for 7 years. The Comanche warrior pulled his horse to a halt, rain lashing his weathered face as lightning split the Texas sky. In that white-hot flash, he saw it again, a Union camp outside Shiloh, smoke rising from burned wagons, and a little girl with yellow hair reaching toward him with desperate fingers before the rebel cannonball tore her life away. He'd been too late then. Always too late. But this cry was real, desperate, clawing through the thunder from somewhere near the fresh graves. Kwana's boots hit the mud before conscious thought could stop him. The sound led him to a patch of disturbed earth, where rain had washed away carelessly thrown dirt. His hands hit the sodden ground, and for a moment he was back at Shiloh, digging frantically through rubble and ash, searching for that yellow-haired child whose name he'd never learned. The earth was soft here, too soft, and his warrior's instinct screamed that this was wrong. Lightning flashed again, revealing a pale hand, bursting through the shallow grave fingers clawing at the storm-darkened sky. The woman beneath was young, her nun's habit torn and filthy, her body curved protectively around 3 tiny forms. Her green eyes blazed with desperate fury as she choked up mud and blood. Dia Dwight, she gasped in Irish Gaelic, then switched to English. "Help them, please. The babies are dying." Sister Magdalena Quinn's voice carried the lilting accent of County Cork. But it was strengthened by something deeper, a fierce determination that reminded Kwana of his own mother's voice when she'd protected her children from cavalry raids. He dropped to his knees, digging with his bare hands, feeling the weight of 7 years of failure lifting from his shoulders as he finally arrived in time. The infants were blue-lipped and motionless, their small bodies cold as river stones. One, a girl with dark hair, stirred slightly when he lifted her from the grave. The others remained terrifyingly still, their tiny chests barely rising and falling. "Who did this to you?" he demanded, scooping up the nearest baby while Magdalena struggled to her feet, clutching the 3rd infant. "Matron Crowell." Magdalena whispered, her voice hoarse from screaming in the grave. "She found out what I discovered about her business. She drugged my tea then." Her voice broke. "She buried us alive, thinking the storm would finish what her cowardice started." The rain hammered down as Kwana helped her onto his horse, the infants wrapped in what remained of her torn cloak. Behind them, the cemetery seemed to exhale secrets into the storm, and somewhere in Hope Hollow, evil wore the mask of charity while counting its blood money. The ride to Kwana's cabin passed in a blur of driving rain and racing heartbeats. Magdalena drifted in and out of consciousness, muttering prayers in both English and Gaelic, her arms never loosening their protective hold on 2 of the babies, while Kwana cradled the 3rd against his chest. His cabin sat 3 miles from town, built with his own hands after the war. When he'd grown tired of being caught between worlds, rough-hewn logs, stone fireplace windows that looked out on wilderness instead of suspicious stares. By the flickering light of oil lamps, the true horror of the night revealed itself. Sister Magdalena was barely 23, her face pale as moonlight beneath the mud, breathing shallow and labored. Dark bruises circled her throat where someone had choked her unconscious. The babies were worse, too unconscious, their lips tinged blue from oxygen deprivation, their tiny bodies so cold they felt like porcelain dolls. "Mary Catherine," Magdalena whispered, focusing on the smallest infant with desperate intensity. Her finger traced the baby's face with infinite gentleness. "She's Sarah Whitehorse's daughter. Crow mother, white father. The town drove them out last winter, but Sarah came back when her time came. She was bleeding, dying, but she begged me to take Mary Catherine, to give her a chance." Kwana had learned field medicine during 5 years of scouting for the Union Army, patching soldiers left for dead in places God had forgotten. But these were babies, fragile as spring flowers, and his weathered hands that had killed men in battle felt clumsy as he worked to clear their airways and warm their small bodies. The 3rd infant, A boy with hair black as his own began to cry, thin but reassuring. The sound cut through Kwana's heart like a blade, because it meant life, meant hope, meant that maybe this time he hadn't arrived too late. "What did you discover?" he asked quietly, massaging the smallest baby's chest, willing her lungs to work. Magdalena's green eyes hardened with a fury that would have done credit to any warrior. "She's selling them, children, babies, to men who don't ask questions and pay in gold." Her voice grew stronger with anger. "I found records hidden in her office, names, payments, destinations, and the girls who got pregnant from the men who visited the orphanage at night." She shuddered violently. "They died in childbirth, all of them. Convenient accidents. How many? Dozens. Maybe more. Girls as young as 13, assigned to help travelers. When they got pregnant, Prudence called it God's punishment. When they died, she called it God's mercy." Outside, the wind howled through ancient oaks, and Kwana felt the weight of approaching danger settling around them like a noose. He'd saved them from the grave, but their survival had only bought them hours, maybe less. By morning, Prudence Crowell would have the entire town believing that a savage had kidnapped a nun and murdered innocent babies. As he worked through the night, using every skill he'd learned in field hospitals, Kwana found himself humming an old Comanche healing song his grandmother had taught him. The melody was soft, wordless, meant to call wandering spirits back to their bodies. He didn't know if it would help the babies, but it helped him focus, helped him believe that maybe the old ways and the new medicine could work together to save these tiny lives. Mary Catherine's breathing grew shallower as the hours passed. But the other two began to respond, color returning to their lips, their cries growing stronger. Magdalena never left their side, her torn habit a testament to her struggle in the grave, her voice offering prayers in both languages, while her hands never stopped moving, offering comfort and warmth. "Tell me about the men," Kwana said during one of the quieter moments when the infants were sleeping, and Magdalena was lucid enough to speak coherently. "Important men. Men with money and influence." Her voice carried disgust that made her Irish accent more pronounced. "Judge Hamilton from the county seat. Deputy Marshal Thornton. Dr. Patterson, though I think he might be—" She paused, considering. "I think he might be afraid of her, rather than complicit. And others territorial officials, wealthy ranchers, even some army officers. A network. A network built on the backs of children who had nowhere else to go." Tears ran down her cheeks, carving clean tracks through the dried mud. "And I was such a fool thinking I could just gather evidence and report it to the authorities. Half the authorities are part of it." Dawn came gray and sullen, the storm having passed, but leaving the world waterlogged and treacherous. Through his window, Kwana could see them coming, a dozen men from Hope Hollow rifles, ready faces grim beneath rain-soaked hats. The sight filled him with familiar dread, to the same feeling he'd had before every battle during the war. At their head rode Matron Prudence Crowell herself, her severe face a mask of righteous fury. She was handsome in a harsh way, 47 years old, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes like winter sky. Her black dress remained pristine despite the previous night's storm, and she sat her horse with the posture of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Beside her rode Deputy Marshal Jake Thornton, his badge catching the weak morning light. Behind him came Tom Bradley from the general store. Dr. Patterson with his medical bag looking pale and reluctant, and most dangerous of all, Silas Briggs, a scarred ex-Confederate whose reputation for violence preceded him like a shadow. "Kwana." Thornton's voice boomed across the clearing, harsh with authority and barely controlled violence. "Come out with your hands where we can see them." Inside the cabin, Magdalena shrank from the window, her face going white as she recognized the voice. "He was one of them," she whispered. "One of the men who visited the orphanage at night." Kwana checked his rifle, made sure his pistol was loaded, then moved to the window where the posse could see him. Through the glass, he could see the men growing restless hands drifting toward weapons as they waited for his response. "The nun is under my protection." He called out, his voice carrying clearly across the distance. "Anyone wanting to harm her will answer to me." Thornton shifted in his saddle, his hand moving to his gun. "You're making this worse for yourself, Kwana. Send her out, and we might consider letting you live long enough to face a judge." But it was Prudence who spoke next, her voice cutting through the morning air like a blade dipped in honey. "Sister Magdalena, I know you're frightened, child. I know this savage has filled your head with lies and threats. But you're safe now. We've come to take you home. She's good at this." Magdalena whispered to Kwana, her hands shaking as she held one of the babies. "She's been lying to people for 15 years. They believe her because they want to believe her because the alternative is too horrible to accept. What about the babies? They can see the children are alive." Magdalena's laugh was bitter as winter wind. "She'll say you stole them from their beds, that you killed their mothers for some savage ritual. The town will believe it, because believing anything else would mean admitting they've been living next to evil for years." Through the window, Kwana watched Briggs dismount, rifle in hand. The man's scarred face, courtesy of Yankee grape shot at Antietam, held the cold determination of someone who genuinely enjoyed violence. His presence here wasn't about justice or rescuing a nun. It was about the opportunity to kill a Comanche legally. "You got until noon." Briggs called out, his voice carrying the drawl of Alabama backwoods. "Then we come in and drag you out. And that nun of yours, well, she might not be quite as pretty when we're done with her." The threat hung in the air like gun smoke, and Kwana felt the familiar cold settle in his chest, the same feeling he'd had before every battle during the war. The cabin suddenly felt very small, very vulnerable. 3 babies, a traumatized nun, and a Comanche warrior against a town full of people who'd already decided what truth looked like. But as he watched the posse settle in for a siege surrounding his cabin with the methodical precision of men accustomed to violence, Kwana realized something that gave him hope. Dr. Patterson had positioned himself at the edge of the group. His face troubled his eyes, avoiding direct contact with Prudence. There was doubt, there may be even guilt. And doubt, Kwana had learned during the war, could be more powerful than bullets. The siege lasted 2 days, but it felt like a lifetime. Prudence had been clever positioning her men just out of rifle range, but close enough to make escape impossible. They took shifts, keeping the cabin under constant watch, while the matron herself returned to town each evening, no doubt spinning increasingly elaborate tales of the savage who had stolen a nun and murdered innocent babies. Inside the cabin, the situation grew increasingly desperate. Magdalena's fever spiked on the 2nd day, leaving her delirious and racked with violent chills. She kept reliving the burial, clawing at imaginary dirt, screaming for help that had almost come too late. During her lucid moments, she clung to the babies with fierce desperation, as if she could protect them through sheer force of will. Mary Catherine was dying. Kwana had seen enough death during the war to recognize its approach and the gray pallor of her skin, the shallow, irregular breathing, the way her tiny body seemed to be shutting down, system by system. The other 2 babies were stronger, but they needed proper care, warm milk medicine he didn't have. On the 3rd morning, as the first pale light crept through his windows, Kwana made a decision that went against every survival instinct he possessed. He waited until the guards changed shift, then slipped out through the cabin's back window while Magdalena dozed fitfully by the dying fire. Hope Hollow at dawn was a different creature than the town he remembered from his infrequent visits. Windows were shuttered tight against the morning light, and the few people on the street hurried past without making eye contact. Fear hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, and Kwana could feel hostile eyes tracking his movements from behind curtains and around corners. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was sneaking through a town that considered him a dangerous savage to seek help from the very people who wanted him dead. But the babies were dying, and Magdalena's fever was getting worse. And sometimes a man had to choose between pride and principle. Dr. Patterson was waiting in his office, his weathered face grave, with more than just concern for the patients he couldn't treat. The old physician looked like he hadn't slept in days, his normally steady hands shaking as he gestured Kwana inside. "Figured you'd come eventually," Patterson said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Heard about the babies. Heard they're dying and that the nun's taken fever. One of them might not make it." Kwana admitted studying the doctor's face for signs of deception. "The nun too, maybe. She's seeing things that aren't there, fighting battles that ended days ago." Patterson nodded grimly, his hands already moving to his medicine cabinet. "Shock, probably. Sometimes the mind breaks before the body does. What Prudence is telling people, it's got the whole town worked up. Half of them want to lynch you, the other half want to wait for the territorial marshal. And you—" The doctor was quiet for a long moment, his eyes studying Kwana's face, as if searching for something specific. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of years of regret. "I've known Prudence Crowell for 15 years. Watched her build that orphanage from nothing, seen her take in children nobody else wanted. Told myself she was doing God's work." He pulled bottles and vials from his cabinet, his movements precise despite his obvious distress. "But there were things. Signs I chose not to see because it was easier than asking questions." "What kind of signs?" Patterson's hand stilled on a bottle of laudanum. "Girls dying in childbirth when they should have lived. Babies disappearing in the night. Men visiting the orphanage who had no business being around children." He looked up, meeting Kwana's eyes directly. "And I provided the laudanum she requested for medical purposes. I told myself it was for the children's pain, but you knew better." "I suspected. God help me, I suspected and did nothing because I was afraid of her, afraid of what she might reveal about my own weaknesses." Kwana felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place. "She had something on you." Patterson's laugh was bitter. "She has something on half the men in this county. Letters, photographs, witnesses to indiscretions, better left buried. That's how she's built her empire, not through charity, but through blackmail and fear." The doctor handed Kwana a small leather satchel filled with medicines and supplies. "These are for the fever. This powder will help the babies breathe better. And this—" He pulled out a small vial filled with clear liquid. "This will counteract laudanum poisoning. If she's drugged anyone, this might save them." As Kwana pocketed the medicine, Patterson caught his arm. "There's something else. Something I need to tell you about Prudence, about what she's really running in that orphanage." "I'm listening." "It's not just an orphanage. It's a breeding ground. She takes in pregnant girls, keeps them until they give birth, and then sells the babies to couples who can't have children of their own. The girls who cause trouble or ask too many questions—" Patterson's voice trailed off. "They have accidents. They have accidents. And the ones who survive long enough to become women, they service the men who keep Prudence's operation funded. It's a perfect system the girls are grateful for. Shelter and food, the men get what they want. And Prudence gets rich while appearing to do Christian charity." The full scope of Prudence Crowell's operation was beginning to become clear, and Kwana felt a cold fury building in his chest. This wasn't just about greed or even cruelty. It was about power, about using the most vulnerable members of society to maintain control over everyone else. "Why are you telling me this?" Kwana asked. Patterson met his eyes, and Kwana saw something there. He hadn't expected shame, but also determination. "Because I can't live with what I've enabled. I've been a coward for too long, but maybe it's not too late to do something right." The trip back to the cabin was a nightmare of stealth and terror. Kwana had to circle wide around the town, using every skill he'd learned as a cavalry scout to avoid the search parties that were now combing the countryside. The posse had grown overnight. Word was spreading through the territory about the savage who'd kidnapped a nun, and bounty hunters were arriving from as far away as Austin and Dallas. By the time he reached the cabin, the sun was setting, and he could see the ring of campfires that surrounded his home like a noose. The sight reminded him uncomfortably of cavalry camps during the Indian Wars, when his own people had been hunted like animals across the plains. Inside, he found Magdalena conscious, but shivering violently, her green eyes bright with fever, as she held Mary Catherine against her chest. The infant was so still. She looked like a porcelain doll, her breathing barely perceptible. "She's been asking for you," Magdalena whispered, her Irish accent thick with exhaustion. I think she knows her time is near." Kwana knelt beside them, his large hands gentle as he examined the baby. Patterson's medicine might help, but it might also be too late. He'd learned during the war that sometimes the kindest thing you could do was let someone die with dignity, surrounded by love, instead of suffering. "I won't let her die alone," Magdalena said, reading his thoughts. "I promised Sarah I'd take care of her, and I keep my promises." As Kwana administered the medicine to both Magdalena and the babies, he told her what he'd learned from Dr. Patterson. Her face went through a series of expressions: horror, disgust, rage, and finally a cold determination that reminded him of his own feelings before battle. "A breeding ground," she repeated, her voice hollow with understanding. "Dear God in heaven, how many girls has she destroyed?" Patterson thinks dozens, maybe more. And it's not just local girls, she's been importing them from other states, telling their families they're going to good Christian homes. "We have to stop her. We will. But first we have to survive long enough to expose her." Outside, the campfires burned brighter as more men arrived to join the siege. Kwana could hear voices raised in anger and anticipation, the sound of men working themselves up to violence. Soon, patience would give way to action, and he would be forced to choose between surrender and bloodshed. The attack came at midnight on the fourth day, preceded by the sound of breaking glass and shouted commands. Kwana had been expecting it, had spent the previous hours barricading the windows and preparing for the inevitable assault. But he hadn't expected them to be so methodical, so determined to leave no witnesses. The first torch landed on the cabin's roof with a shower of sparks, followed quickly by two more. Within minutes, the ancient wood was blazing, filling the interior with smoke and the acrid smell of burning pitch. But these weren't random throws. The torches had been placed with military precision, designed to create maximum destruction in minimum time. "They mean to burn us out." Kwana shouted over the roar of flames, scooping up two of the babies, while Magdalena clutched Mary Catherine to her chest. The infant was barely breathing now, her tiny body limp and cold. They had perhaps 5 minutes before the roof collapsed. Kwana kicked open the back door and dove into the darkness, Magdalena close behind him. Bullets whined through the air where they had been standing, and he could hear Briggs's voice raised in cruel laughter. "Run, you red bastard, run like the coward you are." But Kwana wasn't running. He was leading. The forest behind his cabin was thick with underbrush and fallen logs, perfect for concealment, but treacherous to navigate in the dark. He'd spent months mapping every tree, every hollow, every game trail, preparing for exactly this moment. Magdalena stumbled and felt her strength finally giving out, and for a terrible moment, Kwana faced the choice that had haunted him since Shiloh: save the babies or save the woman. But not both. "Go!" Magdalena gasped, pushing the surviving infants toward him. "Take them. Save them." Before Kwana could respond, a small figure emerged from the darkness, a girl of perhaps 12, her face streaked with dirt and tears. She was one of the orphans from Prudence's institution, her clothes little more than rags, her eyes wide with terror and determination. "Sister Magdalena." The girl whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of pursuit. "I saw what they did. I saw them bury you." Kwana recognized her now, Mary, the supposedly mute child who had been at the orphanage for as long as anyone could remember. Except she wasn't mute. She was speaking, her voice rusty from years of forced silence, but clear with purpose. "Mary." Magdalena breathed, reaching out to touch the girl's face with trembling fingers. "You can talk. I never talked because she hurt me when I did." Mary said, her small hands shaking, but her voice growing stronger. She said talking children ask too many questions. But I can't stay quiet anymore. Not after what I saw her do to you. Behind them, the cabin was fully engulfed, now flames reaching toward the star-filled sky like grasping fingers. The posse was crashing through the underbrush, their voices raised in pursuit, but they were moving too fast, making too much noise. City men, not woodsmen. "I have something?" Mary continued, pulling a leather-bound ledger from beneath her ragged dress. Her book, the one with all the names and money. "She sells babies, Mr. Kwana. She sells them to people who don't ask questions." As they stumbled through the forest, Mary revealed secrets that made Magdalena's blood freeze in her veins. The hidden cellar beneath the orphanage where pregnant girls were kept. The visiting room where benefactors selected their purchases. The special meals that made troublesome children sleep forever. But it was the final revelation that shattered what remained of Magdalena's world. "There's something else," Mary said, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. "About me. About why she kept me alive when she killed the others." "What do you mean?" Mary stopped walking, forcing them to halt in a small clearing where moonlight filtered through the trees. When she spoke, her words fell like stones into still water. "My name isn't Mary. It's Margaret. Margaret Quinn. I'm your sister." Magdalena stared at the girl as if she were seeing a ghost. "That's impossible. My sister died in the Boston fire. She was just a baby, only 2 years old. I was taken during the fire. Prudence saved me, but not out of kindness. She kept me as insurance in case you ever came looking for answers about what really happened to our family." The world seemed to tilt beneath Magdalena's feet. Her sister. Her baby sister, alive all these years, trapped in Prudence's web of lies and cruelty. The sister she had mourned, had said prayers for, had carried in her heart through years of loneliness and loss. "She's been using me to watch you since you arrived in Hope Hollow." Margaret continued, tears streaming down her face. "Making me report on everything you did, everyone you talked to. But when she decided to kill you, when I heard her planning to bury you alive, I knew I had to act." Magdalena reached out with shaking hands to cup her sister's face, seeing in those familiar features the baby she remembered from 15 years ago. "Margaret, my little Margaret, I thought you were dead. I thought I was dead too until I saw you digging in that garden behind the orphanage, asking questions about the babies who disappeared. Then I knew you were the sister Prudence always talked about, the one who might come looking for revenge." They found shelter in an abandoned root cellar 1/2 mile from the burning cabin, hidden beneath a collapsed homestead that had been destroyed during the Comanche raids of '68. The space was cramped and damp, but it was deep enough to conceal them, and narrow enough for Kwana to defend with his rifle if necessary. By the flickering light of a single candle, Margaret had somehow preserved through their flight. They huddled together, like survivors of a shipwreck. Magdalena was burning with fever, her face flushed and her breathing labored. But her arms never loosened their hold on Mary Catherine. The infant had stopped crying hours ago, her tiny body growing cold despite the warmth of the nun's embrace. Margaret opened the ledger she had obtained, her young voice growing stronger as she began to read names and dates that revealed a picture of systematic wrongdoing. Children transferred to strangers for amounts ranging from $50 to $500, depending on age and appearance. Young girls exploited and mistreated, their situations treated as business opportunities. Infants who perished when they couldn't be placed elsewhere, their deaths recorded as natural causes. Listen to this. Margaret said, her finger tracing a particular entry. Sarah Whitehorse died of complications during childbirth. Baby female mixed race unsellable. Disposed of per usual methods. Magdalena's grip tightened on Mary Catherine. But she didn't dispose of her. She tried to, but Sarah got away, brought the baby to me before she died. Because someone warned her, Kwana realized. Someone in the orphanage told Sarah what was planned. Margaret nodded, her young face etched with years of fear and hidden knowledge. It was me. I heard Prudence talking to Dr. Patterson about the half-breed problem, and I knew what that meant. I slipped out that night and found Sarah behind the orphanage, told her to run, but she came back. She came back because she was dying, and she knew her baby would die with her if she didn't find someone to care for her. She trusted you, Sister Magdalena. She said you were the only one in town who looked at her like she was human. As dawn approached, they faced a terrible reality. Mary Catherine's breathing had become so shallow, it was barely perceptible, her tiny body cold despite all their efforts to keep her warm. The other two babies were stronger, but they needed immediate medical care, proper food, and safety that seemed impossible to achieve. There's only one way, Kwana said finally, his voice heavy with resignation. We have to go back. We have to force the truth into the open, no matter the cost. They'll kill us, Magdalena whispered, her fever-bright eyes fixed on his face. Maybe. But if we don't try, those girls in Prudence's cellar will die, and she'll just find new victims to replace them. The cycle will continue until someone breaks it. Margaret looked up from the ledger, her young face set with determination that reminded Kwana powerfully of her sister. There's something else in here. Something that might help us. She turned to a section near the back of the book, where Prudence's careful handwriting detailed a different kind of transaction. Not sales, but blackmail payments. Names of prominent men, descriptions of their indiscretions, and amounts paid to ensure silence. She keeps records of everything, Margaret explained. Every photograph, every witness account, every piece of evidence she uses to control people. If we can get people to see this, they'll have to choose between protecting their secrets and protecting their children. Magdalena finished understanding, beginning to dawn in her fever-clouded mind. Kwana studied the entries, recognizing several names from the posse that had besieged his cabin. Thornton was there, along with Judge Hamilton, and at least half the men who called themselves respectable citizens of Hope Hollow. It's brilliant in its simplicity, he admitted grudgingly. She creates the crimes, then profits from covering them up. The victims become accomplices, and the accomplices become victims. But not anymore, Magdalena said, her voice growing stronger despite her physical weakness. Because we have the truth. And the truth, as my guardian used to say, has a power all its own. As they prepared to leave the cellar, Mary Catherine drew her last breath in Magdalena's arms. The infant's passing was peaceful, a gentle sigh that seemed to carry all the innocence and hope of a life cut tragically short. Magdalena closed the baby's eyes with gentle fingers, then wrapped her in a torn piece of her own habit. She won't be forgotten, she whispered, her voice breaking with grief and rage. None of them will be forgotten. The march back to Hope Hollow took place in the gray pre-dawn light, 3 figures moving like ghosts through the mist-shrouded forest. Kwana carried his rifle ready, knowing they were walking into a trap, but seeing no other choice. Margaret clutched the ledger that contained 15 years of carefully documented evil. Magdalena held the 2 surviving babies, her arms strong. Despite exhaustion, her faith transformed from blind obedience into fierce, protective love. The town was already stirring when they emerged from the tree line, and word spread quickly through the streets like wildfire. The Comanche and the nun had returned, walking boldly down Main Street, as if they owned the place, flanked by a child who was supposed to be safely locked away in the orphanage. Deputy Marshal Thornton was waiting outside the jail, his hand resting on his gun butt. But Kwana could see uncertainty in the man's eyes. Behind him stood Dr. Patterson, his face pale with guilt and fear. Silas Briggs lounged against a hitching post, his scarred features twisted in anticipation of violence, while Tom Bradley and several other townsmen formed a loose circle around the confrontation. "No, Kwana," Thornton said, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "You're under arrest for kidnapping, arson, and murder." But it was Magdalena who spoke, her voice carrying clearly across the growing crowd that had gathered to witness the spectacle. "I wasn't kidnapped, Deputy. I was rescued. Rescued from a grave that Matron Crowell dug for me and 3 innocent babies." The murmur that ran through the crowd was electric with shock and disbelief. Kwana saw faces he recognized, townspeople who had known him for years, who had traded with him, who had never thought of him as a threat. But he also saw the men who had been part of the posse, the ones whose eyes held no doubt about his guilt because they couldn't afford to doubt. "That's a lie," Thornton said, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. "Matron Crowell is a pillar of this community. She'd never what?" Magdalena interrupted, stepping forward despite her obvious weakness. "Never bury a nun and 3 babies alive? Never sell children to the highest bidder? Never murder women who knew too much about her business?" Margaret stepped forward, then holding up the leather-bound ledger for everyone to see. Her young voice cut through the morning air like a blade, clear and strong, despite years of enforced silence. "This is Matron Crowell's record book. It lists every child she's sold, every girl she's murdered, every crime she's committed in the name of Christian charity. My name is Margaret Quinn, and I've been her prisoner for 15 years, forced to watch and help with her crimes." The crowd pressed closer, voices rising in confusion and growing anger. Some believed, others remained skeptical, but all were listening now, drawn by the spectacle and the possibility of scandal. That's when Prudence Crowell herself pushed through the press of bodies, her face a mask of righteous indignation. She was dressed in her finest black dress, her steel-gray hair pulled back in its customary severe bun. But Kwana could see fear flickering in her winter blue eyes like candlelight in a storm. "Sister Magdalena," Prudence said, her voice dripping with false concern. "Thank God you're safe. This savage has clearly damaged your mind with his lies and violence." But Magdalena didn't flinch. Instead, she reached into her torn habit and pulled out a small piece of charred wood, a fragment from Kwana's burning cabin. Using a pin from her hair, she had carved words into the wood, filling the letters with her own blood to make them visible. "Prudence Crowell murdered Sister Catherine Mary Boston, 1863. She read aloud, holding the makeshift message high for everyone to see. The effect was immediate and devastating. Prudence's carefully constructed mask slipped completely, revealing the cold, calculating woman beneath. For a moment, naked hatred blazed in her eyes, and several people in the crowd stepped back instinctively. "You know nothing about Catherine." Prudence snarled, her voice losing its honeyed tone. "She was weak, sentimental, willing to destroy everything for the sake of children who were already damned." "Children like Margaret?" Magdalena asked, gesturing to her sister. "Children like the babies you tried to murder? Children like the girls you keep imprisoned in your cellar?" The crowd gasped at the exchange, and Kwana saw the tide of opinion begin to turn. But Briggs was already moving his scarred hand, reaching for the rifle slung across his back. "Enough talk," the ex-Confederate growled. "Time to end this charade." The gunshot echoed across the town square, but it wasn't Briggs who fired. Dr. Patterson's bullet caught the scarred man in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his rifle clattering across the packed earth. "I've heard enough," Patterson said, his voice shaking with rage and shame. "Dear God, what have I helped create?" But Prudence wasn't finished. With a speed that belied her 47 years, she lunged toward Margaret, a small derringer appearing in her hand like a conjurer's trick. Her face was twisted with fury and desperation. The mask of Christian charity finally torn away completely. "Give me that book," she screamed, her voice cracking with hysteria. "It's all lies, fabrications by a savage and a delusional nun." The derringer's barrel swung toward Margaret's chest, and time seemed to slow to a crawl. Kwana was already moving, but he was too far away. The crowd was frozen in shock, unable to process the sudden transformation of their respected matron into something monstrous. That's when Magdalena threw herself between them, her body shielding her sister as the gun fired. The bullet took her in the side, spinning her around, but she stayed on her feet, her arms still protecting the baby she carried. "The cellar," she gasped, blood spreading across her torn habit. "Under the orphanage, behind the root vegetables. The girls are still alive." Martha Bradley, Tom's wife, pushed through the crowd with the fierce determination of a woman who had finally seen enough. Her voice cut through the chaos like a whip crack. "I've heard stories. Whispers from the women who clean the orphanage. Girls crying in the night, men visiting at strange hours." She pointed an accusing finger at Prudence. "We all suspected, but we were too cowardly to act. Too comfortable with our blindness." The crowd surged forward, then their anger finally finding its target. But Kwana held them back with his rifle, even as his heart hammered with fear for Magdalena. "She'll face justice," he said firmly. "But not with a lynching. We're better than that." Deputy Thornton moved to arrest Prudence, but she backed away, the derringer still in her hand, her eyes wild with the desperation of a cornered animal. "You don't understand," she said, her voice rising to a shriek. "I saved them. I gave value to lives that had none. I made something useful from human refuse. By selling children." Martha Bradley shot back, her face twisted with disgust. "By forcing girls into prostitution. By being practical." Prudence screamed. "By understanding that some lives matter more than others, that civilization requires sacrifice." Margaret stepped forward, the ledger still clutched in her small hands. Despite her fear, her young voice carried clearly across the square. "Tell them about the babies you smothered when they cried too much. Tell them about the girls you poisoned when they got too old to be useful. Tell them about my sister Catherine, who died in the Boston fire you set to cover your crimes." The admission hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Even Prudence's most loyal supporters in the crowd stepped back, finally seeing her for what she truly was. They were mercy killings. Prudence said, her voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the square. "I ended their suffering. I gave them peace. You gave them death." Magdalena said, struggling to remain upright despite her wound. "You gave them death and called it mercy profit, and called it charity evil, and called it God's will." As Deputy Thornton moved to take Prudence into custody, she raised the derringer toward her own temple. For a moment, the entire square held its breath, waiting to see if she would take the coward's way out. "Don't," Magdalena said, her voice carrying surprising strength. "Don't rob those girls of their justice. Face what you've done. Answer for it." Prudence stared at her for a long moment, the gun trembling in her hand. Then she looked at Margaret, at the crowd of people whose trust she'd betrayed for 15 years, at the ledger that contained the evidence of her crimes. "You think you've won?" she asked, her voice cold as winter wind. "This town will turn on you within a week. You're outsiders, freaks, aberrations. They'll find reasons to blame you for everything I've done." "Maybe," Magdalena replied, her voice steady despite the pain. "But at least the children will be safe." Prudence slowly lowered the gun, her face settling into the hard lines of someone who had finally run out of lies. "Take me to jail," she said to Thornton. But mark my words, when the territorial government starts asking questions, when the newspapers start digging into who knew what, and when you'll wish you'd let me put a bullet in my brain." As they led her away, Dr. Patterson knelt beside Magdalena, examining her wound, with hands that shook with guilt and determination. "You're lucky," he said quietly. "The bullet went clean through, missed the vital organs. But you've lost a lot of blood." Kwana was already thinking ahead about the girls in the hidden cellar that Margaret had described, about the surviving babies who needed immediate care, about the long fight for justice that lay ahead. "The cellar," he said to Margaret. "Can you show us where it is?" The girl nodded, clutching the ledger that had brought down an empire of cruelty. "It's exactly where I said. But we need to hurry. She might have hurt them when she realized what was happening." The hidden cellar beneath the orphanage was everything Margaret had described, and worse. They found it behind false walls stacked with rotting vegetables, accessible only through a trap door hidden beneath flour sacks. The smell that rose from the darkness below was a mixture of human waste, fear, and death. 4 girls lay on straw mattresses in various states of malnutrition and drugged stupor. 3 were visibly pregnant, their young faces gaunt with suffering and terror. The 4th, who couldn't have been more than 14, was so emaciated she looked like a living skeleton. Dr. Patterson worked quickly to assess their conditions, while Kwana and several townsmen helped carry them into the sunlight. Margaret moved among them like an angel of mercy, speaking softly in languages they understood: Spanish, German, even a few words of Comanche, reassuring them that their nightmare was finally over. "How long?" Magdalena asked Patterson as he examined the last girl despite her own wound, bleeding through the hasty bandage he'd applied. "Months, maybe years for some of them," the doctor replied grimly. "They've been systematically drugged, malnourished, abused in ways I can barely comprehend. It's a miracle any of them are alive." As they brought the girls into the sunlight, a crowd gathered around the orphanage. The evidence of Prudence's crimes was overwhelming the hidden cellar. The drugged girls, the ledger full of names and transactions, the testimony of witnesses who had been too frightened to speak before. But it was Martha Bradley who organized the response, taking charge with the natural authority of a woman who had raised 6 children and managed a household for 20 years. "Clara," she called to one of the younger women in the crowd, "fetch clean clothes from the church donation box. Sarah will need hot water and soap. Tom, ride to the next county and bring back the territorial marshal. We need someone here who isn't mentioned in that book of horrors." As the townspeople mobilized to help the rescued girls, Margaret provided testimony that filled in the gaps left by the ledger. She spoke with the clear, precise memory of a child who had been forced to witness unspeakable things, her voice never wavering, despite the tears that streamed down her face. "She made me help sometimes," Margaret said, her words falling into the horrified silence like stones into still water. "Made me hold the babies while she decided which ones were worth keeping. She said it was educational, that I needed to understand how the world really worked." "How many?" Martha Bradley asked, her voice tight with controlled fury. "Dozens, maybe more. She kept some records, but not all of them. Some of the babies were never written down anywhere, they were just disposed of." The trial of Prudence Crowell became a sensation that drew reporters from across the territory and beyond. The Dallas Herald sent a correspondent, as did papers from Houston, San Antonio, and even New York. The story of the corrupt orphanage and its network of powerful accomplices captured the public imagination in a way that transcended regional boundaries. The evidence was overwhelming. The ledger provided a detailed record of 15 years of systematic abuse and trafficking. The rescued girls, once they recovered enough to testify, painted a picture of horror that left even hardened journalists struggling for words. Dr. Patterson's confession about his role in providing drugs added another layer of institutional complicity. But perhaps the most damning testimony came from Margaret herself. Day after day, she sat in the witness chair and calmly recounted years of forced silence, of witnessing murders, and being powerless to stop them, of living in constant fear while helping to maintain the facade of Christian charity. She told me I was special, Margaret said during one particularly harrowing session. Said I was her insurance policy, her guarantee that my sister would never come looking for answers about what really happened in Boston. But when Sister Magdalena arrived and started asking questions, I knew I had to choose between saving myself and saving her. The defense tried to paint Margaret as a liar, a disturbed child whose testimony couldn't be trusted. But when Prudence herself took the stand, her arrogance and lack of remorse destroyed any sympathy the jury might have felt. I did what was necessary, she said, her voice cold and unrepentant. I took children who were unwanted, unloved, destined for lives of poverty and degradation, and I gave them purpose. I gave them value. If some of them died in the process, well, they would have died anyway, but without contributing anything to society. And the men who paid to abuse these children, the prosecutor asked. They provided funding for a necessary service. Without their contributions, there would have been no orphanage at all, and those children would have died in gutters instead of clean beds. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all charges. Prudence was sentenced to life in prison, her network of corruption exposed and dismantled. Several prominent men were arrested, their reputations destroyed, their crimes laid bare for public scrutiny. Judge Hamilton was removed from the bench and sentenced to 10 years in federal prison. Deputy Marshal Thornton was stripped of his badge and given 15 years. A dozen other men, including territorial officials and wealthy ranchers, saw their lives destroyed as the full scope of Prudence's blackmail operation came to light. But for Kwana, Magdalena, and Margaret, the real work was just beginning. The orphanage was officially closed, its remaining children placed with families throughout the territory. But the building itself became something else. A school where Margaret could learn to read and write properly, where the rescued girls could heal and prepare for new lives, where children from the surrounding area could receive an education that emphasized compassion over compliance. Magdalena, her wound healed, but her faith forever changed, made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. She requested release from her vows, choosing to remain in Hope Hollow as a teacher and advocate for children who had nowhere else to turn. "The church taught me to serve God," she wrote in her final letter to the Mother Superior. "But I've learned that God is found in the service of the innocent, not in blind obedience to institutions that fail them." Kwana was offered a position as territorial marshal with authority to investigate crimes against children throughout Texas. It was work that called to something deep in his soul, a way to ensure that other children wouldn't suffer as these had. But he also continued his private investigations, following leads from Prudence's ledger to uncover similar operations in other cities. The network they built over the following months became known as the Quinn Foundation, named not for Magdalena, but for Sister Catherine Mary Quinn, and the woman whose death in Boston had started the chain of events that led to justice in Hope Hollow. They worked quietly, carefully, building cases against corrupt officials and religious leaders who had turned charity into a weapon against the innocent. Their first major success came 6 months after Prudence's conviction, when they exposed a similar operation in Houston. The investigation led to the arrest of a bishop and 2 city officials, the rescue of 18 children, and the establishment of new oversight procedures for charitable institutions throughout the state. But perhaps the most important healing happened in private. In the quiet moments when Margaret helped care for the 2 surviving babies from the grave. Thomas and Hope, as they came to be known, grew strong and healthy under the loving care of their makeshift family, their early trauma leaving no visible scars, but creating an unbreakable bond between them and their rescuers. On a warm spring evening, 18 months after the trial, Magdalena stood in the Hope Hollow Cemetery with a bouquet of wildflowers in her hand. She knelt beside a small grave marker that read simply, Mary Catherine Whitehorse, born and died, 1870. Beloved. Kwana found her there as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Behind him came Margaret, now 14, and growing into a confident young woman, leading Thomas and Hope by the hand as they chased fireflies in the gathering dusk. Any regrets? Kwana asked quietly, settling beside her on the grass. Magdalena considered the question, thinking of the life she'd left behind, of the vows she'd broken, the faith she'd redefined. Around them, the cemetery was alive, with the sound of children's laughter, not ghostly echoes, but the real voices of young lives that had been saved and were now free to grow and flourish. None, she said finally. Sister Catherine always said that true faith meant protecting the innocent, no matter the cost. I just took a while to understand what she meant. And now I know that love is stronger than institutions, that truth is more powerful than authority, and that sometimes the greatest act of faith is breaking the rules that prevent us from doing what's right. They walked back toward town together, where Margaret was waiting with Thomas and Hope, where a community was learning to heal from the wounds of betrayal and complicity. Behind them, the wildflowers on Mary Catherine's grave stirred in the evening breeze, and somewhere in the gathering darkness, the memory of all who had died in the service of justice blessed the living who continued their work. Years later, when historians wrote about the period that became known as the Child Protection Movement, they would trace its origins to many sources. But those who knew the true story understood that it had begun in a storm-lashed cemetery in Texas, when a Comanche warrior heard a baby's cry and chose to act. The shallow grave had been dug with haste and covered with careless dirt. But love had proven stronger than earth. Hope had triumphed over despair. And in the end, that had been enough to change not just one town, but an entire nation's approach to protecting its most vulnerable citizens. And in Hope Hollow, where it all began, the children continued to laugh and play and grow their voices, carrying on the wind like promises that the darkness had been defeated, that the light would always find a way to shine through, and that somewhere in the vast Texas sky, the spirits of all those who had fought for justice were finally at peace.